Welcome to Highline BI 348 class video number 13. Hey, if you want to download this workbook, BI 348 Chapter 2 Start or the finished file, click on the link below the video. Hey, in this video, we want to do a little review of Excel's data analysis features. We want to look at sort, filter on the data tab, and of course, one of the more amazing things ever invented, the pivot table on the Insert tab. Now we're going to start with sorting. And here's our goal. We have a proper data set. We would like to sort product, but within product, I would like to also sort the sales. What that means is I would like to bring the Bellin records up to the top, and then within that sort, I want to sort the sales column. Now check this out. Here's Bellin. 3 records. I need to bring these up to the top and then sort biggest, second biggest, and third biggest. And I need to do that for all records. It's easy with the sort feature. Now there's 2 ways we can do it. We can either use the sort buttons up here, or we can use the sort dialog box. Now I'm going to start with the sort dialog box. Now any data analysis feature, whether sort, filter, pivot tables, table feature, and more, you click in one single cell and then enact that feature. I could come up and click this sort dialog box button, boop, but there's a great keyboard and it's Alt-DS. Now the D is for data and S is for sort. So it's kind of nice because it's a keyboard that's easy to remember. Now if you're using the sort dialog box, it doesn't matter which particular one cell you have selected. Alt-DS. Now with the sort dialog box, you come up to sort by. And since we would like our major sort to be product, I'm going to select product. Values are fine, and A to Z. Then I'm going to come up and say add a level. And it's kind of polite. It says sort by product, then by, and we'll select sales. Values, and here I'm going to select largest to smallest. Now when I click OK, instantly check that out. I have the Bellin sorted together, biggest to smallest. I have the quad sorted together, biggest to smallest. Now I'm going to Control Z and show you how to do it with the buttons. This is the method I usually use. Now notice when we use the sort dialog box, it said this was on top, and then the dialog box says then by this. For some people, that's easier to remember. If this is the final major sort, you got to remember if you're using these buttons to do that one last. Now, I'm going to click in a single cell, and it does matter. If I'm using the buttons, I have to be in the column that I want to sort. But any one of them will do. Z to A, instantly, boom. Now, I want you to notice something about the requirement that the sales column has to be sorted before product. If we look at the Bellin records here, notice that by sorting the sales first, it already has the biggest Bellin, then the next biggest, then the smallest. So now when I come over to this column and sort it, of course, the B's will come to the top, and this column will already be pre-sorted. So I'm in a single cell in the product, and now I'm going to click the A to Z. The same result whether you use the sort buttons or the sort dialog box. All right, so that's sort. Now I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Here's filter. There's a couple awesome uses for filter, but one of the more amazing tasks that we can complete is to extract records. In the textbook, they call this a query. Now, what we would like to do is extract from this data set all of the records where the sales rep was Sue and the region was East. This is an AND logical test. We're going to use AND criteria. Now, it's easy to use filter. You click in a single cell. It doesn't matter which one. You can click the button up here. But also notice there's a keyboard right there, Control-Shift-L. Control-Shift-L. And Control-Shift-L is a toggle. You can turn it on whenever you want or off. All right, I'm going to keep it on. Come up to sales rep, and there is a unique list of items from that column right there. I'm going to uncheck select all and then say Sue. Click OK. Instantly, I have filtered on Sue. Now, notice something over here. 34, 37, 45, 46. There are some rows that are hidden. You also have another visual cue because the row headers in Excel now turn blue. You also can see that that field is filtered. Now I come over to region. It is a unique list just for Sue. I unselect all and now say East. When I click OK, instantly I have filtered, hiding almost everything in the data set. Now, if my goal is to take this, extract it, and put it somewhere else, then I simply want to use my keyboard Control asterisk. And notice that my cell is actually hidden, but it's still selected in the data set. I use Control asterisk on the number pad to highlight everything, Control C to copy. And notice it's not just highlighting the outside edge. The dancing ants are dancing around the visible cells. Now, if I'm going to paste this somewhere, one thing I want to try to avoid is Control V, pasting it next to the data set, because it's pasting it there all right, but some of the rows are hidden. So Control Z, you either want to do it below, above, on a different sheet or a different workbook. I'm going to paste this below, Control V. Now, if you want to unfilter, you can come to each one of these and unfilter. You can come up and select clear. You can turn the filter off. I tend to use Control-Shift-LL. What LL does is Control-Shift-L turns it off, which automatically unfilters it. And then the L brings the filter back up. And sure enough, there is our data set. So filtering is quite amazing. And as you look through, and you know from our prereq class, there's all sorts of amazing data type filters, like different date filters, different text filters, and even different number filters. All right, now I want to go over to the sheet pivot table. This is going to be perhaps our most amazing feature for data analysis. Now, I have a bunch of notes here reminding you about what you should remember from earlier classes here. These notes are also over in our PowerPoint slides. I want to look at a few quick examples of pivot tables. Now, here, our goal is we want to add sales for product. I click in a single cell, insert, pivot table. That brings up the dialog box, escape, or since we're going to do this so often, let's just use the keyboard. Click in a single cell, Alt-NV. It'll always guess right because we have row headers, column headers in Excel, or empty cells all the way around. New sheet is the default. I don't want that. I want to put it here just because we're doing some small examples right next to the data set. I'm going to click in E26 and click OK. Now we're going to drag product down to rows. And instantly, from the product column with many repeats and duplicates, we get a unique list. As we mentioned in last video, if these are the entities on which we're going to collect a bunch of calculations, this can be called an element. Now I'm going to drag sales down to values. Boom, instantly within a few clicks, we have our unique list and the sum of sales for each product. Now, that row labels is a terrible label, and forget the textbook. They'll show you that row labels, as will many other sources for how to do pivot tables. In terms of our goal as data analysts to provide useful information, I'd rather that say product. So I'm going to go up to Design, Report, Layout, and Tabular. Now, as we pivot this table and do things with it, it'll always say product. Now, number formatting. Remember, we don't highlight the cells like we would out here. You click in a single cell, right-click, and not format cells. You want number formatting. By using number formatting, and by the way, that does not show up when you right-click in a normal cell. It only shows up when you right-click in a pivot table. So number formatting. Now when we apply number formatting, this formatting will follow the field around as we pivot our pivot table. Now I'm going to choose to show no decimals. You could select accounting or whatever you like. I'm going to click OK. All right, now let's come down here. Count. Oftentimes we're counting frequencies. Alt-NV. I'm going to put it right next to this data set and click OK. I'm going to drag product down to rows, sales down to values. design, report layout, show in tabular. Actually, you can use outline too, and in fact, I will this time. Outline is slightly different in its layout, but it will always show the field names and not have any gray lines. Now I want to change the calculation. Right-click, and we have two options. Show values as. We're not going to use that in this video, but we will use that throughout the class. It has all sorts of amazing calculations for us. We're just going to change the function, summarize values by, and I'm going to say count. Instantly, we have a count of actual transactions. So we had 5 transactions where we were selling quads. Now notice when we made this calculation with our pivot table, we dropped products into rows and sales down into values, and then we had to change the calculation. Now that's a good illustration to remind us of how we can change calculations. But if we really want to count the transactions for each one of these products, we can do it a different way using just the product column. So I'm going to click in a single cell, Alt and V, and I'm going to paste it right next to that existing pivot table and click OK. We simply drag product down to rows to get our unique list, but then drag this text field down to values, and it will default to count because it is a text field. Over here, it defaulted to sum because it was a number field. And notice we get a slightly different label up at the top, count of products. If we were to call both of these frequency, then they would look exactly the same, I guess, except for design, report layout, and show in tabular. All right, now we want to go look at our next example. Data types, we were talking about empty cells. Let's just see what happens when we create a pivot table to add product sales, and there's an empty cell. In essence, this is an inconsistent data type, number, 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 empty cell. So I'm going to click in a single cell, Alt-N-V, existing, location, product down to rows, sales down to values, and check that out. It defaults to count when it sees inconsistent data. Now, it's not a problem. If we really are missing that one and we're not going to fill it in, we can come and right-click, summarize values by, and switch it back to sum. Design, report layout, tabular, right-click, number formatting, something like currency. Now here we had inconsistent data type, number, and empty cell. But now we want to go down and look at another example for inconsistent data type for this date. But before we do that, I want to remind you about the grouping feature. Now in Business 210, we did a lot of grouping in pivot tables. And man, was it a lot easier than our formula alternatives. A simple example of grouping is, hey, look, it looks like we have some January and some February for 2015. Now, we could build some formulas to take an upper and lower limit and add, but forget it. If you can use a pivot table, it's a lot easier. I'm going to click in a single cell, Alt-N-V. I'm going to put it right next to the data set, click OK. And we're going to drag date down to rows, and instantly we get a unique list of dates. Right-click in the dates and group. Now notice it comes right up. It gives us the min and max and is offering us months. I see the same year, so I'm not going to select years. When I click OK, that's amazing. I simply drag sales down to values, and instantly I have grouped by month. I am making a sales summarization calculation where the lower limit is January 1 and the upper limit is January 31st, 2015. Design, report layout, right-click, number formatting, something like currency. I'm going to click keep 2 decimals. All right, that's just to remind us. And we actually have a couple more examples of grouping. And then later in this video series, we'll have many examples of grouping. But I want to come up here. This is one of the most common mistakes that people encounter in pivot tables, mostly because grouping by date is one of the most beloved features. Now let's just try it. Alt-N-V, and I'm going to say existing sheet right next to it. Click OK. And I'm not going to select that because it thinks it's going to bump into there. So I'm going to Alt and V, and I'm going to try and put it maybe right in H91. Click OK. Drag date down to rows, and watch this. Well, you can already see trouble. The pivot table should give us a unique list with a sorted data set. 119's at the top. You already know that there's trouble, but right-click Group. And this is one of the more common pivot table pitfalls that people post questions about in online Excel forms. Cannot group that selection. Now, unfortunately, the error message is not very polite. It's not telling you that there's an inconsistent data type. But when you're grouping with dates, either there's an empty cell or an inconsistent date in that column. So when I click Escape, it looks like my visual cue is saying this date is not a serial number date. It's a text date. It's aligned to the left. The rest of them look like real serial number dates. Now, how do you fix that, of course, is you convert that text date back to a number date, and we'll talk all about that in next week's series of videos. Now, I want to go over to this last sheet, Pivot Data Type for Grouping, for this video and talk some more about grouping. Now, we'll click on this sheet, and here's our data set, time, age, and sales amount. Now, time, we'll see how to group that a couple of videos ahead, but we want to talk about age and sales amount. Now, actually, these are both continuous quantitative variable. Even though this looks discrete because it's counting years, really age, you can choose to measure it however you want, down to the fraction of a second. So for our pivot table discussion here, notice this does not have any decimals. This one does. So when we group age, the pivot table will create labels that are not ambiguous. But when we group numbers with decimals in a pivot table, it will create ambiguous labels. So let's go ahead and try and group the sales amount first. All we want to do is create categories like $50 to $100, $100 to $150, and count how many transactions in each. All right, you ready? Alt and V. And I'm going to put this right, say in cell E3. Click OK. I drag sales amount down to rows. I click in my unique list of sales amounts, right click, and group. It gives me the min and the max. I'm going to decide to use 50 as my starting number, tab, tab, 400 as my ending number, and tab. By in this dialog box means the increment, and I'm going to use 50. Again, a couple videos ahead, we'll talk about how we actually calculate or decide on each one of those numbers. Click OK. And look at that, 50 to 100, 100 to 150, 150 to 200. I can even drag the sales amount down here, and watch. It's going to default not to sum, but to count, because it sees this as a grouping category. Now, I can click here and type frequency and enter. I can come up to design, report layout, and tabular. But you should be a little bit bothered by this report because I'm not sure whether the hundreds should be counted in the first category or the second category. So when you group decimal numbers, it will always have the upper limit for one category, and then the immediate next category will list the same number but for the lower limit. Now, the rule is in a pivot table, the upper limit is never included. Now, there's a few ways we can fix this. I can highlight, go to Home, find and select and click Replace, or use the keyboard Control-H. Now, I actually already did this. That wasn't supposed to be there, right? Find what? A dash. I want to find all those little dashes. Replace with space, up, space, to, space. When I click Replace All, boom. Click OK, click Close. Up to insinuates the math operation. Hey, the sales amount is greater than or equal to 50 and less than 100. Control-Z. Another way we could actually do this is to click and totally just type our own label and indicate something like upper limit is not included. Control-Enter, and I'll use something like word wrap in the home ribbon. Change the column width. Double click. Now, the idea here is that if we're creating useful information, we want to be unambiguous. Now, the truth is if you go out there and look in most textbooks or blogs with pivot table grouping and most spreadsheets you'll look at, they don't. And in some ways, if you're using it internally, as long as you're aware of where that 100 goes, it's OK. But I'm going to always try and list my reports with unambiguous labels. Now, let's try to group the age category. Alt-N-V, existing location. I'm going to try and click below and click OK. Age down to rows. Instantly, I get a unique list. Right-click, group. I'm going to decide, say, 15 tab, 75 tab, in groups of 15, and enter to get that OK. And look at these labels, 15 to 29, 30 to 44. There's no ambiguity here. Those labels are perfectly all right. I can click and drag age down to values. There I am counting. Design, report layout, and show in tabular. And I think I have a description over here. So when grouping in a pivot table, numbers with decimals trigger ambiguous labels. Numbers with no decimals create unambiguous labels. All right, in this video, we definitely talked about grouping in a pivot table. Over on the pivot table sheet, we talked about some inconsistent data when you are creating pivot tables. We talked about some basics of pivot tables. We even talked about sort and filter. Now, in our next video, we'll talk about a data visualization tool, conditional formatting. All right, we'll see you next video.